So, have you ever heard of a 200-year-old foreign policy suddenly making front-page news? Well, that is exactly what happened with something called the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to dive into this. What exactly is this policy, and why on earth is a statement from 1823 still shaping our world today? You just heard from John Bolton, who was a U.S. National Security Advisor back in 2019. Now, that wasn't just him name-dropping a historical term. No, that was a signal. It was a declaration that this old, really powerful, and let's be honest, controversial idea was officially back in play, being used to challenge modern rivals like China and Russia in Latin America.
So that's the big question we're tackling. To really get why it's making a comeback, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go all the way back to the beginning, to a world full of brand new republics and very old empires. Okay, let's set the scene. It's 1823. The world looks completely different. The United States is still a pretty young republic itself, and it's looking south and seeing all these new nations in Latin America winning their independence. And frankly, it's making them a little nervous. The big fear in America was that the powerful monarchies over in Europe, we're talking France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, might decide to help Spain reclaim its lost colonies. So President James Monroe decided it was time to draw a line in the sand.
Now, the crucial thing to understand here is that this was just a unilateral declaration. It was mostly written by the Secretary of State at the time, a guy named John Quincy Adams, and it was a really bold statement. It basically split the world in two and told Europe, you stay on your side of the planet and we'll stay on ours. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, not quite.
And this is where the story gets really interesting. The United States makes this grand, tough guy declaration, but here's the question. Did it actually have the power to back it up? The honest truth? Nope, not at all. The U.S. had a tiny army and a really small navy. For the most part, European leaders just kind of scoffed at it. Austria's Prince Metternich actually called it a new active revolt. So if the U.S. couldn't enforce it, why did it actually work? The answer, believe it or not, comes from a very unexpected ally, Great Britain. See, Britain had its own very powerful reasons for wanting Latin America to stay independent. They had set up all these amazing trade routes, and if Spain came back into the picture, those markets would be closed off. So the Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, basically became the doctrine's unofficial guard dog.
In fact, you don't have to take my word for it. Years and years later, President John F. Kennedy said it himself. The doctrine's early success had less to do with American strength and a whole lot more to do with the fact that British interests just happened to line up perfectly.
And this quote from the British Foreign Secretary at the time, George Canning, just says it all. Britain's support wasn't about some noble ideal of independence. It was about business. It was about securing economic dominance. For a big chunk of the 19th century, South America was, for all intents and purposes, part of an informal British economic empire.
So, for decades, the doctrine just kind of sat there, mostly unused. But as the United States grew into a huge industrial and military power, the meaning of this doctrine was about to get turned completely on its head. This was a major turning point.
By the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, the United States is no longer that weak little nation. Oh no. It now has the muscle to enforce its will. And under President Theodore Roosevelt, the doctrine went from being a defensive warning to Europe to an offensive justification for America to act.
This edition was called the Roosevelt Corollary, and it was a radical change. It basically said that if any Latin American country was guilty of, quote, chronic wrongdoing, and that usually just meant they weren't paying their debts to European or American banks, then the U.S. had the right to step in and act as an international police power.
So you see what happened? The doctrine did a complete 180. The original idea was like a defensive shield, meant to keep European powers out, but the Roosevelt Corollary twisted it into a policeman's badge, giving the U.S. a reason to go in. The original meaning was totally flipped on its head.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea. It had real-world consequences. The U.S. Marines were sent into multiple countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, often to take over their customs houses and make sure foreign debts were paid. This whole period became known as the Banana Wars, and it created a lot of deep resentment and mistrust of the U.S. all throughout Latin America.
Okay, so how did we get from this idea of a hemispheric policeman all the way back to the headlines of today? Well, the doctrine just kept evolving, adapting itself to new global threats.
During the Cold War, the definition of European political systems was stretched to include Soviet communism, so the doctrine became a key reason for opposing Soviet influence in the region. This all came to a head during the incredibly tense Cuban Missile Crisis,
where President Kennedy basically invoked the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine.
After the Cold War ended, the whole idea seemed to fade into the background. And then, in 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry went on record and officially declared it dead, saying the U.S. now wanted a partnership of equals. It really looked like the policy was finally just a relic of the past.
But then, it came roaring back. The Trump administration pulled it out of the history books and started using it as a tool to push back against what they saw as growing interference from China and Russia in the hemisphere, especially in places like Venezuela.
So all of this brings us to today, and to the doctrine's really complicated legacy. I mean, after 200 years, how are we supposed to think about its impact? Was it a force for good, or was it a tool for oppression? The truth is, it really depends on who you ask and when you ask them. From one point of view, it was a protective shield that helped shelter new, fragile nations from old, predatory empires. But from another perspective, especially if you're in Latin America, it became a weapon of domination, a reason for the U.S. to intervene in their affairs.
When you boil it all down, the Monroe Doctrine has really been like a mirror. It's always reflected how America sees itself and its place in the world, shifting from that vulnerable young nation to a confident regional boss, and finally, to a global superpower trying to deal with brand-new rivals.
And so, that leaves us with the big question for today. In our modern world, with globalized economies and threats that cross every border, is this 200-year-old idea a useful guide for the future, or is it a dangerous relic that really just belongs in the history books? It's definitely something to think about.